Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Commercial Linkage Fee public meeting. My name is Karina and I will be facilitating the meeting. Presenting today will be Rachel, the Deputy Director for the Housing Department, and David and Kevin with KMA, who will be leading the presentation. This meeting will be recorded. The chat feature will be available to ask questions throughout the presentation, but please be aware that the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. The raise hand feature is also available, for which you'll be able to ask questions at the end of the meeting. I will be using the chat feature to keep track of all the questions. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you everyone for taking your time to join us this evening. This has been a long-awaited policy issue here in San Jose, where we've been spending time just contemplating the commercial linkage fee and working on it over the past several months. And so we just appreciate taking your time tonight to join us. And as was stated, we're going to go through the presentation, and then we will provide time for questions in the end. So, all right, so with that, a little bit of project background. So the City Council provided direction in March 2019 to move forward with a nexus and feasibility study for the commercial linkage fee here in San Jose. Some of the items that the City Council requested us to take a look at were specific to having the study include a discussion of high-tech office, single user office, retail, industrial, hotel, and office as commercial building types. So those building types were actually specified in the council direction. And so as you see, as we walk through the study, the study will reference these different types of development. There was also a request from the City Council that a sensitivity analysis be included. So really what that means is not just a, an exact number or even a range, but then also trying to understand what are the sensitivities in the market that may impact feasibility as we go forward. And so that was also a specific request that the City Council directed us to do. Also, we were encouraged to include outreach to developers, employers, other stakeholders throughout the process. And so that has absolutely been something we've done. We've had several meetings along the way. We've had public meetings. Tonight is an example of that. But as these reports have been developed, there's been a lot of conversation with developers, and other stakeholders who are just really vested in interest in this work. And so, and then the direction was to bring back our proposals no later than January 2020, which we all know has come and gone, or as soon as possible. And so what really happened, I want to just make clear, is that we were actively working on all of this when the COVID pandemic came and really impacted our city. And so what we did is we just had to take a break on focusing on this work. But now, as things have somewhat stabilized, what we realized is just that this is one of our top priority policy items that we needed to pick back up and get moving on again. So, and as many of you know, we had there's lots of policy that's kind of been in this boat, but I really feel like this is one of the most important, or, one of the policies that we decide as a city really has to come soon. So we have dug back in and spent some time working on this, and we're really looking forward to bringing this to council in the coming weeks. All right, and so I think with that, I'm going to be turning over the presentation to David Dozema and Kevin Feenley from KMA, who have been working diligently with us on putting together both a nexus and feasibility study. So go ahead. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Rachel. Again, I'm David Dozema with Kaiser Marston. Our scope for the city included preparing a nexus study, a feasibility study, and within that, looking at linkage fees in nearby cities, as well as participation in the public meetings and outreach process that Rachel described. Many of you are familiar with what a commercial linkage fee is, but just to briefly say that it's an affordable housing impact fee that applies to commercial development or non-residential development. There's about 50 programs in the state of California, and many of those are in the Bay Area. And most of the major cities on the West Coast have a program. I'm going to cover this nexus study briefly, and we'll be spending more of our time on the feasibility study. The purpose of the nexus study is to meet a requirement for implementing an impact fee, that you demonstrate a reasonable relationship between the fee and the impacts that the fee is intended to address, in this case, affordable housing impacts. So the nexus study really satisfies a legal requirement for implementing the fee. The concept behind the nexus study is that when we build new commercial buildings, those add jobs, and those jobs are a range of compensation levels, including some that are lower paying. And so there's a need for affordable housing by a share of the new workforce. The nexus study quantifies that need for affordable housing and looks at the cost of delivering new affordable units to those workers who need it. And that becomes the basis for the maximum fee conclusions of the nexus study, which we show here. And which it's very typical for a study like this to conclude with very substantial maximum fee levels. And it's also very typical for communities to implement fee levels that are well below those maximums based on feasibility for development projects, among other considerations. And that's a major reason for the next component of the study that we'll address, which is the real estate feasibility analysis. The purpose of that study is to look at representative commercial development projects for the city of San Jose and their ability to sustain a potential new commercial linkage fee, inform the selection of fee level by building type and by geographic area of the city. The main components of the study are a real estate pro forma analysis, looking at the revenues and costs associated with commercial development. Also, some sensitivity testing was done on that pro forma analysis to see how it would be affected by changes in certain assumptions. And that was all done in early 2020 before we were impacted by the pandemic, which has changed a lot of things. And to address those changes, we conducted a qualitative review of the potential implications of the pandemic on the findings. Other components of the study were looking at fees as a percentage of the overall development cost of commercial projects, which can also be helpful in engaging the possibility that fees will influence the decision to develop or not develop. And again, we included a survey of linkage fees in other jurisdictions. So the pandemic, it has resulted in some very significant job losses nationally, and that's been true here in the San Jose metropolitan area as well. Over 100,000 jobs were lost. It's caused a pause in leasing activity as tenants, reassess what their needs really are in the midst of the pandemic, or take a wait and see approach. It's frozen up the lending for speculative commercial development projects, and that's made it less likely that speculative development is going to move forward until the pandemic is over. So we know that the pandemic is a negative factor in terms of feasibility of commercial development, but we haven't taken any specific steps to adjust the real estate pro forma analysis that was done. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One being that we just don't have enough data available to do that right now that reflects the pandemic conditions in terms of lease transactions or land sales. That's one reason. The second reason is that even if we did have that data available, it wouldn't really tell us what the conditions are going to look like on the other side of the pandemic when projects are more likely to actually move forward. So there's just uncertainty there, and running more numbers on it doesn't really resolve it. And so we haven't done that. So the effects have been different by land use. For office, there's been weakening of market demand for space, but there's entitlement activity that shows developers have confidence that the market will eventually recover. It's an expression of belief in Silicon Valley over the long term, as well as the city of San Jose. Hotel and retail have been among the most adversely impacted by this, just from the fall off in demand for travel, as well as a shift in the retail spending habits of consumers. There are some exceptions in essential business categories, but some severe impacts to retail. Industrial has probably held up the best, and part of that is explained by warehouse and logistics-based demand as people shift their spending habits towards e-commerce, while there's warehouse and logistics space that's needed in order to make that work. These are the building types that are addressed in the feasibility study, and they reflect projects that the city has seen recently or has in the pipeline. That's what we use to define the characteristics of these representative projects. We cover warehouse, light industrial, office at several different densities, neighborhood retail, hotel with both surface parking and structured parking. And these are the geographic areas that are addressed in the study. So we have separate feasibility findings for each of the areas you see on the map. And San Jose is a big city. Conditions are not the same throughout. There's differences in market factors like rents, land costs. There's also differences in existing city fees and differences in the types of development that different parts of the city see. I'm going to turn it over now to Kevin Feeney to walk through the pro forma analysis that was prepared.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. Well, as David mentioned, the pro forma analysis reflects pre-pandemic market conditions and is an indicator of fee levels supported based on the assumptions when we prepared the analysis. Next slide, please.
I'm pushing the button, Kevin, but it's not turning yet. Okay. All right, there we go.
Great. Okay. The indicator of feasibility in the analysis is land value. We solve for what the prototypes can afford to pay for a development site, and we compare that residual land value to a target land value that's based on recent comparable sales in the same market area. If the residual land value is above that target land value, that's an indicator that the prototype is likely feasible. Below the target, likely infeasible. The estimated development cost before land for the prototypes ranges from below $200 a square foot for warehouse distribution to nearly $800 a square foot for the high-rise office R&D prototype. We subtracted these non-land development costs from the supported private investment of each prototype to arrive at a residual land value, which we'll get to in the next slide. Next slide, please.
I'm not sure. Okay.
For example, for the mid-rise office in North San Jose, through the feasibility analysis, we estimated a residual land value per land square foot of $70 per land square foot. which is greater than the land value target in this submarket based on comparable sales of about $50 per land square foot. We then tested the impact that the commercial linkage fee would have on development feasibility. And so a $5 per building square foot fee reduces the residual land value to about $60 a square foot of land, which is still above the land value target. A $10 per square foot fee is essentially the breaking point for this prototype, where any additional increase in the linkage fee for this prototype brings the land value, the residual land value below the target and into marginal or weaker feasibility. The following table shows the results of this same testing for all the prototypes in all the geographic areas. It's a lot to unpack, and I think the report provides some additional important context. But one fee level I'd like to focus on is the supported fee in downtown for office of $25 a square foot for mid-rise to $30 per building square foot for high-rise. These fee levels are based on an expectation of higher rents than existing averages or a premium for new space. Next slide. As shown here, this chart compares the average rents in San Jose and nearby communities to the pro forma assumptions. So the blue bars represent the average rents in these communities for both new and older office space. The orange boxes represent the highest rents achieved in each submarket, and the X's are where our pro forma assumptions ended up. So as you see in North San Jose and West San Jose, our pro forma assumptions are in line with the highest rents achieved in each submarket for the newest, highest quality office projects. In downtown San Jose, there aren't new office projects upon which to base the rent assumptions. But through our research, we've estimated that projects in the pipeline are targeting rents in the range of $5 to $5.50 per square foot per month triple net, which is well above the average rents of the existing supply in downtown San Jose. Given the uncertainty and unproven nature of the office rents in downtown, we tested the effect that a change in the rent assumptions would have on the supported fee levels. And with a decrease in office rents of only 3 to 4%, or about 20 cents per square foot per month, so from $5 per square foot to $4.80, the commercial linkage fee is no longer supported for the downtown office prototypes. With the slight increase, the supported fee is significantly greater, and parking also has an effect on the supported fee level, a pretty pronounced effect. This type of sensitivity is common in pro forma analyses, but particularly important to keep in mind in downtown where the rent assumptions are still unproven and could change.
So I'm going to speak to large high-tech end users, which is a category that's a special category of high-tech. Much of the office market in San Jose could be characterized as sort of a tech-oriented office market. This speaks to both the tech use as well as, being a major tech corporate end user that's actually developing the space for its own use. And the pro forma analysis that Kevin described doesn't adequately capture the decision-making process for a company in that position. Real estate is not their main business. They're not focused on necessarily rents and returns, and as that being the focus of the decision to build or not, they have appear to focus on more of a longer-term vision, their overall corporate space needs, their corporate campuses as a tool for attracting the top talent they need for their business. And because of that, there are some prominent examples out there of major high-tech corporate campuses where the level of spending and investment in those campuses goes beyond what you see with a typical office building. And we show in the slide a range of 15% to 65%, which really just reflects 3 examples that we looked at of major headquarters campuses. And the fact that there's this higher level of spending in these campuses is suggestive of a lower degree of cost sensitivity overall, and potentially less cost sensitivity relative to a potential new linkage fee as well. But we're the city to wish to act on that and establish a separate rate for high-tech end users. There could be some challenges to doing that. And one of those is that there just really is no precedent for doing that, having a separate rate for a particular type of user and ownership structure. And there's also challenges just in terms of designing how it would work. That type of investment premium, just amongst the 3 examples we looked at, ranged pretty broadly. And if you were to look more broadly than the examples that we used, you would expect probably even greater variation, both potentially up as well as down. You may not find that premium with every tech user. I mean, is a hard drive maker gonna have that same premium as a social media company, just as an example? So you get into questions as to what counts as high tech, what's big enough, is it just headquarters where you see that kind of premium, or is it other facilities? What do we mean by end user? So there's some challenges that would need to be confronted. And so important to keep in mind with regard to this information. This slide addresses a separate way of expressing the findings, just taking illustrative fee levels, and they go from $5 to $30 per square foot, and expressing those as a percentage of what it costs to build a project. And the higher the linkage fee is as relative to the total cost of the project, the more likely it is to affect a developer's decision to either build or not build. And this type of information is maybe most useful in considering how the linkage fee rate might be applied to different building types relative to one another. So take, for example, the warehouse distribution. That's a lower cost building, lower rent building. So a fee imposed on that kind of a use of $5 is about 2% of cost. If you look then at the mid-rise category, you don't get to 2% of cost until you're at about $15 per square foot. And if a 2% impact on your decision to build or not build at $15 is about the same as $5 for warehouse. So it's just a tool for potentially scaling the fees by use. This slide addresses linkage fees that have been adopted by other communities in the Bay Area. If you focus on the column about office rates, you can see that the first examples there are within the West Valley and Peninsula. And that's where you tend to see higher linkage fee rates, stronger office markets in those communities. And then if you go below, you see Fremont, Milpitas, Pleasanton, Oakland, where you see more moderate linkage fee rates, generally speaking, where the office markets are of more moderate strength. This takes the same information and expresses it relative to office rents per square foot. So if you look at the vertical axis, it's the linkage fee rate per square foot, and then the horizontal axis is office rents per square foot. And so you can see towards the right-hand side of the chart, which is the higher rent side of the chart, that the cities in the West Valley as well as San Francisco that have these higher linkage fees, that correlates just broadly with higher office rents, which drives it's a signal of the strength of their office market and drives feasibility of office development in those communities. And then the yellow bars that you see are where San Jose kind of fits in on the chart in terms of at least the office rent part of the equation. West San Jose and downtown, the averages across all the space there, Class A space there is about $60 a square foot, which is similar to Santa Clara. And then North San Jose is about $10 a square foot less than that. And these are, for purposes of this chart, full service rents revenue, triple net as we've described elsewhere. So I'm going to now turn it over to Rachel again. If she's still there.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to get my video back on. Hold on. All right. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So thank you for going through the study for all of us so that we can just understand the work that was put into this in order to get us here so we can consider these important policy recommendations. And I just wanted to go through the upcoming steps that we have for this process. So right now we are currently conducting our public outreach and roundtable meetings. So we're in that phase right now. And of course, this meeting is a part of that. And we will be crafting our staff recommendations. And that will be based on all of the information provided in the reports and all of the feedback that we're receiving through this meeting and through others where we are listening to different stakeholders and perspectives. And then we'll be crafting our recommendations, which will be released on August 14th. And then they will be considered by the City Council on August 25th at the City Council meeting. And so that is our plan. And now I think I can turn it back to Karina, who will be facilitating our discussion this evening.
Yes, so we did get a few questions throughout the presentation. So team, I'll just go down each question in the order that they came in. So the first one says, I'm really excited we are close to enacting the CLF. What can residents of San Jose do to help make sure developers don't pack the council meeting and defeat it?
So, okay, so I think that is, I think what we want to do is we just want to make sure that there's a lot of awareness of what's happening with the with these decisions, and we just want to engage as many people who are interested in this topic as possible. So we're excited to see so many participants this evening, and we just want to encourage people to participate in the upcoming City Council meeting as well on August 25th.
So our next question says, how will the policy deal with pipeline projects? That is, planning projects that are already on file and being reviewed and processed by the city. These projects could not have assumed a fee that didn't exist when they began their project.
Can you help with that one a little bit, Chris, or do you want me to answer it?
So I think that's a fair question. Obviously, the city's still working on what our recommendation will be to council. We'll be presenting, a number of different recommendations based on the work that's been done to date. And that's sort of part of this process of gaining public outreach, public feedback, is to understand, different perspectives on things like that. Obviously, it's common when we've implemented major fees or major programs in the past to provide some consideration around pipeline provisions. However, council's also given staff direction dating back to October of 2019 to ensure that we've been noticing projects that have received new entitlements, that this fee is coming. So, that has yet to be determined at this time, but there's certainly a range of options available.
So the next question says, did you study recent sales of commercial buildings? Isn't that an indication of future strength of our market because of increase in value?
Well, two answers to that. So the first is that in the pro forma analysis, based on the market data from late 2019 to early 2020, there is an analysis of sales over the last few years of commercial buildings, and you can see how values have increased since if this is a question more on the market strength since the pandemic. We did not look at sales that have occurred since the pandemic. I know that sales activity in general is fairly low, and most of the market uncertainty is not so much focused on what the next couple months are going to be, but what will be the impacts on pipeline projects targeted for construction 6 to 9 months from now. And so regardless of what we've seen in limited data to date, that longer term impact is still uncertain.
And the next question says, between 2019 Q2 and 2020 Q2, CoStar reports gross asking rents in San Jose for Class A office in San Jose citywide appear to jump significantly. Doesn't that counteract the weakened demand comment if prices have increased even from Q1 to Q2 in 2020?
So, okay. That's you want me to deal with?
Go ahead and answer that question,
okay.
And then I'll ask the next.
So first, it's actually a similar answer to the prior question, because there has been a significant drop-off in leasing activity in the second quarter of 2020, which would be the only quarter pertinent to this post-pandemic question. So the pool of space that's actually being leased and even listing is less than before. So that we don't have a lot of examples of leasing transactions that have actually occurred since the pandemic. And the second point is that through the fourth, we've captured half of that increase through the fourth quarter of 2019, and the rent stated of the high 50s, low 60s gross in downtown are fairly close to what we're already showing in the report. But we can take a closer look at that information as well. And I see the rest of the question here. Wouldn't the characterizations reflect unproven market conditions for achievable rents in downtown of 40-50% over existing space need to be updated based on the increasing rents? We can take a look at that. I think from the rents that are quoted here, I think we're already pretty close to that. So, and in general, the feasibility conclusions wouldn't necessarily be impacted by these 1 quarter increases in the average rents for all types of space, because all of these rents quoted are significantly below the assumptions that we're using, which are based on what new space would achieve. So an increase in the average rents for both new and existing space is a positive sign, but it wouldn't cause us to reconsider the assumptions we're using for these higher for the kind of top of the market rents, which aren't even reflected in those averages. We would need to see some more transactions actually occurring for the top of the market.
Okay, the next question. The report notes that the feasibility model is sensitive to parking ratios and estimated transportation fees when looking across geographies. For a part of the geography encompassed by the NSJ prototype, the Berryessa Urban Village developments would be able to reduce their parking ratio by at least 50% due to proximity to BART and bus transit, and not be subject to the same transportation fees as the rest of North San Jose. Based on the notice sensitivity to these costs, would it seem appropriate to separate Berryessa out from the North San Jose geography? Would it be possible to calculate Berryessa's feasibility separately?
And I think Berryessa it's a pretty small area, and so you'd have to be focusing on, I think, narrowly the land sales within that area, which are probably pretty limited. I think it would be possible to run a pro forma that modified the development fee assumptions that are cited. I don't know if the parking ratio comments are sort of borne out in the pipeline projects that we're seeing. I don't know if, Kevin, you're able to comment on that at all with respect to parking ratios for projects we're seeing in the Berryessa area. But what would be important to the pro forma is you're not only, I guess the possibility of reducing your parking ratio, but whether projects are actually being designed around that lower parking ratio.
So the next question says, a pro forma for a downtown high-rise included a 19-story building. The city's municipal code defines a downtown commercial high-rise as being higher than 150 feet. Would that definition seem appropriate for such a tier based on your understanding of the data?
I think a high-rise over 150 feet would be a high-rise. Yeah.
Next question says, why did you assume an unproven market expectation for downtown office for the feasibility analysis? Did you make similar assumptions for other project prototypes in other areas?
Well, with respect to downtown, we mirrored what the projects that are in the pipeline are generally targeting in order to work. And so we're trying to model in our pro forma what the projects in the pipeline are in effect, modeling and deciding to go forward with those projects. And as Kevin articulated, there aren't comparable space examples that we could use. I mean, there just isn't the same level of brand new space, top quality space that we could use as a comp in our pro forma. And so that's part of the reason why going with these higher rent assumptions is justified. Now, if we had brand new Class A space in the downtown that was renting for quite a bit less than our pro forma, well, that would be a different story. Then we would have evidence that this rent just doesn't make sense, and our finding would be different. But our reasoning was that the projects that are moving forward are reaching for these rents that we have in our pro forma, and there's this belief, at least there's belief as of early 2020 that was achievable.
So the next question, you slightly touched on it, but it says, can you clarify where the Berryessa Bar Urban Village falls within the geographies and whether there are differences in the fees and parking expectations for this area?
So the way we've defined the geographic areas for study, the Berryessa area would fall within the North San Jose and vicinity geography, at least for purposes of our study. That doesn't necessarily mean the city in designing its fee schedule would have to follow those boundaries exactly, but that's sort of the definition we used in our study. Could you restate sort of the second part of that question?
And then it says, And whether there are differences in the fees and parking expectations for this area.
I can jump in on that, David. So just to sort of clarify, and this probably touches on the earlier question slightly. So the Berryessa Urban Village is outside of the North San Jose Policy Development Area, which is where you see the majority of the traffic impact fee, as often discussed. However, it's in a different area development policy area. It's in the Maybury 101. So there's a different structure around those fees, but it carries still a fairly significant and not too dissimilar burden from a transportation infrastructure cost perspective. As it relates to parking ratios, the expectation around parking ratios is the same for the use citywide. There are opportunities to reduce parking ratios within our zoning code and general plan. These are based on proximity to transit. So obviously the urban village is very proximate to the new BART station, but many of the sites in North San Jose have similar opportunities given their proximity to the VTA light rail lines as well. So, so they actually perform relatively similarly. I think the big question, just to kind of touch slightly on the earlier question, is that the Berryessa area still remains a very unproven market. So we haven't seen any office development in that area. And we've actually only seen very limited new office development throughout the rest of North San Jose as well. So I think sort of based on those assumptions, that there's definitely some similarity on how they're performing.
So our next question says, hello, residential care is listed within table 1-4 Nexus Analysis maximum fee conclusions with a maximum supportable commercial linkage fee. However, this use is not studied nor mentioned anywhere in the remaining 152-page document. Of the uses studied, residential care facilities are most similar to in regards to size, jobs, function as hotels. The average rate for hotels in table 1-3 commercial linkage fee levels in other cities, the average from the full list of similar municipalities is $7.14 per square foot. What is the assumed to be adopted rate for residential care? When will this be solidified?
Well, I can speak to just the rationale for including it in the study, but not necessarily addressing it in the feasibility work. And that was because this is a use that, you know, has some characteristics of a commercial use, also has some characteristics of a residential use. It is currently addressed in the city's inclusionary program and has been addressed in the city's affordable housing impact fee program. But there are situations where those residential requirements only partially apply to the building, and it applies only to those portions of the building that are qualify as residential units by virtue of having certain features such as a private bathroom and certain kitchen facilities. So including it in the Nexus study would allow the city to potentially expand application of the current requirement under the inclusionary policy to, in some cases, a whole building rather than part of the building. And so it provides that flexibility. But it wasn't specifically addressed in the feasibility study because it was felt, I think, that the focus is more important to study these other commercial prototypes that you see in the study, and that would be sort of the more valuable focus of our study. And those choices, I think, were reviewed at a series of public meetings back in a long time ago now, November 2019.
And I can also jump in and kind of answer the rest of the question too, is so as staff develops our recommendations for all of these different building types, we plan to include a recommendation for this type as well. So that will be included as part of our staff recommendations, which will be released on August 14th. 14th. Thank you.
So the next question says, what is entitlement activity?
So that's just getting approvals for your project to be built. So there's probably Chris or Rachel could speak to it more specifically, but it's basically the approvals you need to build your project.
The next question says, will you provide a copy of this PowerPoint presentation after the town hall?
It's available to the city. I don't know if there's a plan to post that on the website.
We can do that. Yes, we can make the slides available, and then if we're also recording the presentation, we could make that available too. So we'll post those on the website.
Next question says, the fee comparisons in the figure of other cities has not been updated for 2021. Will staff update these figures before presenting to council? Also, the second figure hasn't shown the increasing rents in FY 2020.
Well, I don't believe that there was a plan to revisit the fee comparison prior to next Friday. There are certain cases where there's been annual indexes since the date we surveyed the program applied given the new fiscal year. So there are some cases where that hasn't been accounted for. In most cases, the fee levels are generally pretty similar to where we surveyed them last year. We're not aware of any major updates. Certainly if there have been, we could revise the report to reflect that prior to next Friday, if that has happened, but not a plan to resurvey.
The next question says, will the slides of this presentation be available to the viewers? And the answer is yes. Next question, it seems clear that San Jose can support a relatively robust CLF as in our surrounding communities. How will this be reflected in the staff recommendation?
So obviously, we're going through the process of developing staff's recommendation right now. We have a nexus study that tells us what the sort of maximum legally supportable fee is. We have a feasibility study which assesses, what ultimately the market can bear. And then staff's analysis is continuing to really take into consideration all the other public policy sort of aspects as we consider what the appropriate amount of fee to recommend that then council would obviously make a determination on. So as Rachel already noted, their recommendation will be coming out on the 14th, so a week tomorrow, and that will have more information kind of on that point as we release that memorandum.
Next question, is there a possibility that small business owners would be impacted by this fee down the road? Like maybe the additional costs developers incur would be somehow passed down to small business owners who may rent these spaces?
Yeah, so I mean, I think those are very much the types of sort of public policy questions that we're trying to address and answer. It's very hard to kind of draw a direct link between sort of costs incurred by developers to sort of smaller businesses further down the road. What we can expect to see is adjustments probably in costs, or sorry, in the rent basis to be able to support it. So that raises questions around the ability to of developers to move forward on their project. But I think it's difficult for us to analyze that on a very direct basis. But it's certainly something that we're looking at and considering as we put together the recommendation.
And it looks like this next one may be the last question. Why can't you push back the city council vote for a more comprehensive study on the impact of the pandemic. Quarter 2 of 2020 is just the net being of the pandemic's impacts to lease rates and investments.
So Rachel, you can jump in as necessary. What I will say is this is definitely a priority policy sort of question that council wants us to bring forward for them to make a determination. Obviously, there's a lot of things in flux as it relates to the pandemic and the future of real estate development throughout the city and throughout the region that we're going to have to watch closely. I think the thing to bear in mind is that you know, the way that development works is that projects that are going through planning entitlement now probably won't go into construction for at least a year or two, which will give us some time to sort of assess the fee, assess the impact of that fee on sort of how the market is considering San Jose and whether or not it's correctly placed. I think whenever we make significant policy decisions in the context of, you know, changing you know, regional, national, or even international factors, we have to be aware of those things and be able to adjust as necessary down the line.
So we did get another question. It says the big issue is the pipeline projects. When a project submits an entitlement application to the city, the project already has a contract for the land purchase at a fixed price. Isn't it true that these kinds of fees / taxes usually come out of the residual land value, which means a new fee / tax after the land value is locked in could impact the feasibility of the jobs projects that the city wants?
Well, it's true that if you have a fixed land price, then obviously you cannot address the impact of the fee on your project budget by reducing your land value. So the argument can be made in that case that in order for that project then to work, you need rents to be just that little bit much higher in order for that project to pencil. So that's sort of the other way that a project can take the new fee into account and its economics, besides just getting concessions on the value of its site.
So it looks like that's the end in the chat in terms of questions. No, it looks like that's the end for questions, unless anyone else has anything else to add.
Yeah, I would just say thank you to everyone for tuning in this evening. I know that we have been releasing, so I mean, first we released the Nexus study, then the feasibility study. There's a lot of information in all of those reports, so we just encourage you to take a look. And if you have any questions in the coming days, please reach out to staff. Karina is trying to coordinate everything for us. And then also Chris and I are available if you have any questions that kind of come up as we get a little closer to the city council meeting later this month. So again, thank you for your time. And yeah, we appreciate all of your thoughtful questions this evening as well.
Thanks again, everybody.